High in the snow-covered ranges of Colorado, where the wind whispered through pine trees and the world seemed to forget the existence of men, lived Elias Boone. People in the nearby town rarely spoke his name without lowering their voices. To them, he was more legend than manna, figure seen from a distance, carrying firewood across his shoulder or guiding a mule through narrow, icy paths. Some called him stubborn, others called him broken. No one truly knew him. Elias preferred it that way. His cabin stood alone on the edge of a steep ridge, built from thick logs, darkened by years of weather and silence. Smoke rose from its chimney each morning, a quiet signal that he was still there, still living, still choosing solitude over the noise of the world below. Life in the mountains was not easy, but Elias had never wanted easy. Each day began before sunrise. He would step outside into the biting cold, his breath turning to mist in the frozen air, and begin his work. There were traps to check, wood to chop, water to gather, and repairs to make. The mountain demanded respect, and Elias gave it everything. He spoke little sometimes, not at all, for days. But silence didn't bother him. In fact, he trusted it more than words. Years ago, Elias had been different. There had been a time when he laughed easily, when he sat among others, when the warmth of people mattered more than the cold of the wilderness. But something had changed him. Something quiet and deep, like a crack in ice that spreads until the whole surface breaks. No one in town knew the full story. Only fragments remained, whispers of loss, of a promise that had gone unkept, of a man who walked away one winter and never truly returned. So Elias built his life far from them all. Down in the valley, however, the town had not forgotten him. To them, Elias Boone was a problem that never quite went away. He was strong, capable, and dependable in times of need, but he refused to belong. He came down only when necessary, trading furs or supplies, offering short nods instead of conversation. Children watched him with wide eyes. Adults exchanged uneasy glances. He shouldn't be alone up there, some would say. A man can't live without people forever, others insisted. Winter that year was harsher than most. Snow piled high against rooftops, and the winds howled longer into the night. Supplies ran low, and fear crept quietly into the hearts of the townsfolk. In times like these, community mattered more than ever. And yet, Elias remained alone on his mountain. One evening, as lantern light flickered inside the town's meeting hall, a small group gathered. Their voices were low but serious. They spoke of survival, of unity, of the need to bring every wandering soul back into the fold. And inevitably, the conversation turned to Elias. "He's strong," one man said, "stronger than most of us. But strength won't keep a man whole. He needs a reason to come back," another added. "Something to tie him to the world again." There was a pause before someone spoke the idea that would change everything. "What if we give him one?" The suggestion was simple, yet bold. In their eyes, it was practically even kind. If Elias wouldn't return to society on his own, perhaps society could reach him in another way. A wife. Not out of cruelty, but out of belief that companionship could heal what solitude could not. The decision was not made lightly, but once spoken, it took root quickly. They convinced themselves it was the right thing to do. After all, people needed people. Even a mountain man. Far above them, unaware of the plans unfolding below, Elias sat by his fire. The flames danced across the rough wooden walls of his cabin, casting shadows that shifted and stretched like memories he refused to face. Outside, the wind pressed against the structure, rattling it gently, as if trying to remind him that the world still existed beyond his door. Elias stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, not anger, but something quieter. Loneliness. He shifted, adding another log to the flames, pushing the feeling aside as he always did. The mountain was enough. It had always been enough. Or so he believed. By morning, everything would begin to change. Because down in the valley, a decision had been made. And soon. The silence Elias had built his life around would no longer belong to him alone. The morning arrived quietly, as it always did on the mountain. A pale winter sun stretched across the snow, turning the endless white into something almost golden. Elias Boone stepped out of his cabin, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. The air was sharp, biting at his skin, but it felt familiar, honest, even comforting. He expected nothing unusual from the day. But the mountain had other plans. As Elias moved toward the woodpile, something caught his attention. At first, it was just a distant sound, faint, almost lost in the wind. He paused, listening carefully. The rhythm grew clearer, hoofbeats. That alone was enough to make him frown. No one came this far unless they had no other choice. Elias turned slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the narrow trail that wound its way up from the valley. Through the drifting snow, A small group began to take shape. 2 men from the town, bundled in heavy coats, guiding a horse. And behind them, someone else. Elias's jaw tightened. By the time they reached his cabin, the tension in the air was thick, enough to feel. The men avoided his gaze as they tied the horse near the fence. One of them cleared his throat, as if searching for the right words. "Morning, Elias." Elias didn't respond right away. His eyes had already shifted to the figure standing. A few steps behind them, Sheol was wrapped in a simple cloak, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Sheol's snow clung to the hem of her dress, and her boots were clearly not made for mountain travel. Her head was slightly bowed, as if she were trying to disappear into herself. She looked fragile. "Why are you here?" Elias finally asked, his voice low and steady. The men exchanged a quick glance. "We brought someone," one of them said carefully. "I conceive it." Another pause. The wind filled the silence between them. "It's for you," the second man added. Elias's expression darkened. "I didn't ask for anything." The first man stepped aside slightly, gesturing toward the young woman. "Her name is Clara." At the sound of her name, she lifted her eyes for just a second. That brief moment was enough for Elias to notice something unexpected. Beneath her nervousness, there was a quiet awareness, a kind of strength that didn't announce itself, but didn't disappear either. Still, none of this made sense. "You came all this way to introduce me to someone?" Elias said, his tone edged with disbelief. "It's more than that," the man replied. "The town. We thought it was time." "For what?" Another hesitation. Then, the truth came, simple and direct. "For you to stop being alone." The words hung in the cold air. Elias let out a short, humorless breath. "So you climbed a mountain to fix my life?" "No," the second man said quickly. "We came to help you live it." Elias shook his head, already turning away. "Take her back." Clive flinched slightly at his words, though she didn't speak. "She can't go back," the first man said. That made Elias stop. "What do you mean, she can't go back?" The men looked uncomfortable now, shifting their weight as if the snow beneath them had suddenly become unstable. "She has no one admitted. No family left. No place to stay. Winter's been hard, harder than most." Elias glanced at Clara again. She hadn't moved. Her hands were still tightly clasped, her shoulders slightly trembled, just from the cold, but from something deeper. Fear, perhaps. Or uncertainty. "She'll be safer here," the second man added. "With you." Elias let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "You don't even know me." "We know enough." Another long silence followed. Elias looked from the men to the woman they had brought, and back again. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, heavier than the snow on his roof. This wasn't a simple visit. This was something they had planned. "You don't get to decide this for me," he said firmly. "No," the first man agreed. "But we're asking you to try." Elias's gaze lingered on Clara once more. She finally looked up again, meeting his eyes fully this time. There was no defiance in her expression, no expectation, just a quiet, steady vulnerability. She wasn't demanding anything from him. She was waiting. That, somehow, made it harder. Elias exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. The logical choice was clear. Send her back, close the door, return to the life he understood. But something held him in place. Maybe it was the way she stood there, despite everything. Or maybe it was the faint, unfamiliar feeling that had begun to stir in his chest. "Just for a few days," one of the men said softly. "Until the weather settles." Elias didn't answer right away. Then, with visible reluctance, he stepped aside and gestured toward the cabin. Clara hesitated for only a moment before moving forward. As she passed him, Elias felt something shift, small but undeniable. The men wasted no time leaving, as if afraid he might change his mind. Within minutes, the sound of hoofbeats faded back down the mountain, leaving only silence behind. A different kind of silence. Now, Elias stood at the doorway, watching the empty trail. Then he turned back toward the cabin, toward Clara. His quiet, predictable world had just been interrupted. And deep down, he knew nothing would feel the same again. The cabin felt smaller with another person inside. Elias noticed it immediately. It wasn't that the space had changed, the same wooden walls, the same steady fire, the same worn table near the window, but something about the air was different. Now, less still, less certain. Clara stood just inside the doorway at first, as if unsure whether she truly belonged there. Snow melted slowly from the edges of her cloak, leaving faint droplets on the wooden floor. She glanced around quietly, taking in every detail without a word. Elias closed the door behind them, the sound echoing louder than usual. "You can sit," he said, his voice calm but distant. Clara nodded softly and moved toward the chair near the fire. She sat carefully, keeping her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight despite her clear exhaustion. The warmth seemed to reach her slowly, like she wasn't used to comfort. Elias watched her for a moment before turning away. He grabbed another piece of wood and placed it into the fire, more out of habit than necessity. Neither of them spoke again. The silence stretched, not empty, but uncertain. For Elias, silence had always been something solid, something reliable. But now, it felt fragile, like it could break at any moment. Clara didn't disturb it. That was the first thing he noticed. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try to fill the quiet with nervous chatter. She simply existed within it, as if she understood its weight. After a while, Elias walked over to a small shelf and took down a tin cup. He filled it with warm water and placed it gently on the table near her. "You should drink," he said. Clara looked up, slightly surprised, then gave a small nod. Her hands trembled just a little as she reached for the cup, but she managed a quiet thank you under her breath. Her voice was soft, so soft it almost blended into the crackling of the fire. Elias said nothing, but he heard it. The rest of the day passed in cautious distance. Clara tried to help where she could. She watched Elias as he worked, learning by observation rather than asking. When he gathered supplies, she organized them. When he prepared food, she quietly set the table. But it wasn't easy. The mountain wasn't forgiving, especially to someone unaccustomed to it. Clara's movements were careful, sometimes hesitant. More than once, she nearly dropped something or stumbled slightly on the uneven floor. Each time, she steadied herself without complaint. Elias noticed that too. By evening, the sky outside had turned a deep shade of blue, and the cold crept closer to the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned steadily, casting a warm glow across the room. Elias prepared a simple meal, nothing elaborate, just enough to fill the silence between them. He placed a plate in front of Clara, then sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Clara gave a small, almost uncertain smile and began to eat. It wasn't much, but it changed something. Elias found himself watching her not out of suspicion, but curiosity. She ate slowly, carefully, as if mindful of every movement. There was a quiet grace in the way she carried herself, even in unfamiliar surroundings you've never lived. "In the mountains," he said suddenly. Clara shook her head. "I can tell." She lowered her gaze slightly, but there was no embarrassment in it, just acknowledgement. Another silence followed, but this one felt different, less tense. Later, as night settled in, Elias prepared a place for her to sleep near the fire. Laid out extra blankets, making sure they were thick enough to keep out the cold. "You take this spot," he said. "It's warmer." Clara looked at him, clearly surprised again. "You don't have to," she began softly. "It's fine," he interrupted. She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." That word again. Elias turned away before responding. When the lights dimmed and the fire softened into glowing embers, the cabin grew quiet once more. But sleep didn't come as Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, aware of every small sound, the shifting of blankets, the faint rhythm of Clara's breathing, the wind brushing against the walls. He wasn't used to this. Not the presence, not the awareness, not the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. Across the room, Clara lay still, her eyes open in the dim light. She wasn't sleeping either. The unfamiliar space, the new life, the uncertainty of it all, it rested heavily on her. Yet she didn't speak. She simply turned slightly toward the fire, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders. Two strangers, one cabin, and a silence that, slowly, was beginning to change. By morning, it wouldn't feel quite as heavy, but neither of them knew that yet. The night deepened around the cabin, wrapping it in a quiet stillness that felt heavier than before. The fire had burned low, its glow soft and unsteady, casting faint shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving the mountain unusually still, as if it, too, was waiting. Inside, Elias Boone remained awake. He lay on his side, facing the ceiling, listening. At first, everything seemed normal. The gentle crackle of dying embers, the faint creak of wood adjusting to the cold, Clara's breathing, soft and steady, across the room. But then, something changed. A small sound broke through the silence. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but it carried something Elias couldn't ignore. A quiet, strained breath. Then another. He turned his head slightly, his attention sharpening. Clara shifted under the blankets. At first, it seemed like nothing more than restlessness. But then her breathing became uneven, fragile, as if she were struggling against something unseen. Her hands tightened in the fabric, and a faint tremor ran through her shoulders. Elias sat up slowly. "Clara," he called, his voice low. No response. He frowned, watching more closely now. She turned slightly, her face barely visible in the dim light. Even from a distance, he could see the tension there, the way her brow had tightened, the way her lips parted as if trying to speak, but no words came. only silence. Elias stood, crossing the small space between them with quiet, careful steps. He didn't rush. He wasn't a man who reacted quickly, but something about this felt different. "Clara," he said again, a little firmer this time. Still, nothing. Her breathing hitched again, sharper now, and her hands gripped the blanket as though it were the only thing anchoring her. For a moment, Elias hesitated. He wasn't used to this being needed, being close, stepping into someone else's fear. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself that kind of presence, but he didn't step back. Instead, he knelt beside her, keeping just enough distance not to startle her further. "You're safe," he said quietly. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. Clara's eyes opened suddenly. For a split second, they were wide with fear and focused, searching. She looked at him, but it was clear she wasn't fully present, as if she were still caught somewhere between memory and reality. "Clara," he said again, softer now. Her lips parted. She tried to speak. He could see the effort, the urgency, but no sound came out. Her throat tightened, and her gaze shifted, panic flickering behind her eyes. Elias felt something shift inside him, confusion, at first. Then realization. This wasn't just fear of the mountain. This wasn't discomfort from being somewhere new. This was something deeper, something that had followed her here. "Hey," he said gently, lowering his voice even more. "You don't have to talk." The words seemed to reach her. Her breathing slowed slightly, though her hands still trembled. Elias glanced around, searching for something any might help. His eyes landed on the small wooden table, where a piece of paper and a bit of charcoal rested from earlier. He reached for them and brought them closer, placing them carefully near her. "If you can't say it," he said, "you can show me." Clara stared at the paper. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached out. Her fingers were unsteady as she picked up the charcoal. She hesitated, as if even this simple act carried weight, then began to write. The sound of charcoal against paper was soft but steady. Elias watched, his expression unreadable but his attention unwavering. When she finished, she pulled her hand back, leaving the paper between them. Elias picked it up. The message was short, simple, but it hit harder than anything she could have said out loud. "When I'm afraid, I lose my voice." Elias stared at the words. Something about them settled heavily in his chest. He looked back at her. Clara's eyes had lowered again, as if she expected disappointment or worse, rejection. Her hands tightened in the blanket once more, bracing for something she had likely faced before. But Elias didn't pull away. He didn't question her. He didn't turn cold. Instead, he sat there quietly, the paper still in his hand, letting the truth of it sink in. All this time, he had assumed her silence was distance or hesitation, but it wasn't. It was fear, not weakness, not emptiness, something she was carrying. Elias exhaled slowly, placing the paper back down. Then, after a brief pause, he did something that surprised even himself. He stayed. Not just beside her, but present. "You're all right?" he said quietly, his voice steady now. "You're here?" Clara didn't respond with words, but her breathing began to ease. The tension in her shoulders softened, just slightly. And though her voice hadn't returned, something else had. Trust. Elias leaned back against the wall, still awake, still watching, not out of caution, but something quieter, something steadier. The night stretched on, but neither of them faced it alone anymore. And for the first time since she arrived, the silence between them didn't feel uncertain. It felt understood. Morning settled gently over the mountain, bringing with it a pale, steady light that softened the sharp edges of the world outside. Snow still covered everything in sight, but the air felt calmer, less biting than the days before. Inside the cabin, a quiet rhythm began to form. Elias moved, as he always did, steady, efficient, guided by habit. He added wood to the fire, checked his tools, and prepared a simple breakfast. Yet there was a subtle awareness in his movements. Now, as if he were no longer working entirely alone. Clara sat near the window, watching the morning unfold. She seemed more at ease than before, though her quiet nature remained. Her hands rested in her lap, but her gaze moved often, observing, learning, understanding the small details of this new life she had been placed into. When Elias set a plate on the table, she looked up and offered a faint, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice was there but fragile, like something that could disappear again if pushed too far. Elias nodded once and sat across from her. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Not anymore. After breakfast, Elias reached for his coat. "I need to check the traps," he said. "It'll take a while." Clara nodded, her expression attentive. For a moment, it seemed like that would be the end of it, but then she stood, hesitating slightly before stepping closer to the table. She picked up the piece of paper from the night before and the small bit of charcoal. Elias paused, watching. Clara wrote something quickly, then turned the paper toward him. Can I help? Elias looked at the words, then back at her. You don't have to, he said. She didn't lower the paper. Instead, she added another line beneath it. I want to try. There was something steady in that message. Not forceful, not demanding, just quietly certain. Elias considered it for a moment. The mountain wasn't easy. It didn't forgive mistakes, especially for someone unfamiliar with its ways. But Clara wasn't looking away. She wasn't shrinking back like he might have expected. She was choosing to step forward. All right, he said finally. Stay close. Clara nodded, a small flicker of determination crossing her face. The cold hit them the moment they stepped outside. Clara pulled her cloak tighter, her breath visible in the crisp air. She looked out across the vast, snow-covered landscape, her eyes widening slightly, not in fear, but in quiet awe. Elias noticed that too. He led the way down the narrow path, his steps sure and practiced. Clara followed carefully, placing her feet where his had been, learning through observation rather than instruction. At first, her movements were cautious, slow, deliberate, but as they continued, she found a rhythm. Adjusting to the uneven ground and the weight of the snow beneath her boots, Elias glanced back once or twice, not because he doubted Herb, but because he was paying attention. When they reached the first trap, Elias knelt to check it. Clara stood nearby, watching closely. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just observed every detail, committing it to memory. After a moment, she crouched beside him, pointing lightly to one of the knots in the rope. Elias followed her gesture. That keeps it secure, he explained. Clara nodded, then reached for the charcoal again, writing quickly on the paper she carried. Show me again. Elias blinked slightly, surprised. Most people would have asked with words, or not asked at all. But this was different. All right, he said, repeating the motion more slowly this time. Clara watched carefully, her focus unwavering. They moved from one trap to another, like that, step by step, moment by moment. Elias showed her what he could. Clara absorbed it, asking questions in her own quiet way. Not once did she complain about the cold. Not once did she hesitate to try. By the time they turned back toward the cabin, the sun had risen higher, casting a soft glow over the mountains. Clara's steps were more confident now, her movements less uncertain. She wasn't just following anymore. She was learning. Inside the cabin again, the warmth greeted them like an old friend. Clara set the paper down on the table, her fingers slightly stiff from the cold. She flexed them gently, then looked toward Elias. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, quietly, she spoke. Thank you for showing me. The words were soft but clearer than before. Elias paused. It wasn't just that she had spoken, it was that she had chosen to. You're learning fast, he said. Clara's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. She didn't write anything this time. She didn't need to. The space between them had changed again. What had once been silence, filled with uncertainty, had become something else. Entire, quiet understanding, built piece by piece, not through long conversations, not through forced closeness, but through patience, through effort, through meeting each other where they were. Elias turned back to his work, but something about his expression had softened, and Clara, standing by the table, no longer looked like someone who didn't belong. She looked like someone finding her place, one step at a time. The days began to change. What was once a quiet, uncertain routine inside the cabin slowly turned into something steadier, something shared. The mountain was still vast and unforgiving, but it no longer felt as isolating as it once had. Spring was approaching. It didn't arrive all at once. Instead, it revealed itself in small, quiet ways, the snow softening at the edge as the sunlight lingering a little longer each evening, the faint sound of water beginning to move beneath the frozen ground. Inside the cabin, those changes were reflected, just as gently. Clara had grown more confident. Her steps were no longer hesitant as she moved through the space. She worked alongside Elias with a growing sense of ease, tending to daily tasks with care and quiet focus. She no longer needed to watch his every move to understand what to do. She had learned, adapted, and made the rhythm her own. Elias noticed. He noticed everything. The way she no longer flinched at sudden sounds. The way her hands had steadied, no longer trembling with every small action. The way her eyes, once filled with uncertainty, now carried something calmer, stronger. And then there was her voice. It hadn't returned all at once. At first, it came in whispers, soft, careful, as though she was testing whether it would stay. A quiet yes, a hesitant no. Small words, spoken only when she felt safe enough to let them out. Elias never pushed her. He never asked her to speak more than she could. But every time she did, he listened. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the window, Clara stood just outside the cabin, her face turned toward the open sky. The The snow around her had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath. Elias watched her from the doorway. She seemed different. Not just more comfortable, but lighter. Clara took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling gently. Then, almost without thinking, she whispered something into the open air. The words were too soft to reach him, but he saw the way her lips moved. He saw the moment her expression shifted: surprise, followed by something brighter, hope. She turned back toward the cabin, noticing Elias standing there. For a second, she hesitated, as if unsure whether to retreat into silence again, but she didn't. "I said something," she told him, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry. Elias stepped closer, his expression steady. "I figured," he said. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes lowering for a moment before lifting again.
"It didn't disappear,"
she added. Those words held more weight than they seemed. Elias understood that. "Good," he said simply. And that was enough. Later, that evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, they sat together near the fire. The cabin was warm, filled with the soft crackle of burning wood. Clara held a piece of charcoal in her hand, turning it between her fingers. She hadn't used it as much lately. Elias noticed that too. "You don't write as much anymore," he said. Clara looked up, slightly surprised. Then she glanced down at the charcoal again, her expression thoughtful. "I don't need to." "As much," she replied slowly. Her voice wavered slightly, but it held. Elias nodded. There was a quiet pause between them, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just still. After a moment, Clara spoke again. "It was easier to stay quiet," she admitted. "It felt safer." Elias leaned back slightly, listening. "And now?" he asked. Clara hesitated, searching for the right words. "Now, it feels different," she said. "Not gone, but not as Penny." Elias studied her for a moment. "Fear doesn't always leave," he said. "Sometimes it just changes." Clara nodded softly. "I think it is." The fire crackled gently between them, filling the silence that followed. But this silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything they didn't need to say. Elias had changed too. Though he spoke little, there was a difference in the way he carried himself. The sharp edges of his solitude had sought. He no longer moved through the cabin like it belonged only to him. It belonged to both of them. Now, not by force, but by choice. Clara shifted slightly, pulling her blanket closer around her shoulders. Then, after a brief pause, she spoke again. "You stayed," she said quietly. Elias frowned slightly. "Stayed." "That night," she explained. "You didn't leave." He looked at the fire, his expression unreadable for a moment. "I wasn't going to," he said. Clara's gaze softened. "Most people would have," she replied. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he added another piece of wood to the fire. Watching the flames rise again, "I'm not most people," he said finally. Clara smiled, small, but certain. "No," she said, "you're not." Outside, the last light of day faded into evening. Inside, something steady and unspoken settled between them. They hadn't fixed everything. They hadn't erased the past, but they had done something just as important. They had faced it, dashed together. And in doing so, they had begun to heal. Not all at once, but enough to see the difference, enough to feel it, enough to know that whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone. Spray arrived quietly on the mountain. The snow had begun to retreat, slipping away from the edges of the land and revealing the earth beneath, dark, steady, and ready for something new. Streams of melted ice traced their way through the slopes, and the air carried a softness it hadn't held in months. The world was changing, and so were they. Elias Boone stood just outside the cabin, watching the horizon as the first light of morning stretched across the sky. The stillness of the mountain remained, but it no longer felt as empty as it once had. Behind him, the cabin door opened softly. He didn't turn right away. He already knew who it was. Clara stepped outside, wrapping a light shawl around her shoulders. The air was cool, but no longer harsh. She paused for a moment, taking in the view, the open sky, the quiet movement of water, the gentle shift of these seasons. Then she walked toward him. Her steps were steady. Now, confident. Elias glanced at her as she came to stand beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked out at the mountains, sharing the silence that had once kept them apart, and now brought them together. "It's different," Clara said softly. Her voice was clear. Not hesitant, not fragile, just hers. Elias turned his head slightly, studying her expression. "It is," he agreed. Clara let out a small breath, her eyes tracing the distant peaks. "I used to think silence was the only way to feel safe," she said. "Like if I stayed quiet, nothing could reach me." Elias listened, his posture relaxed but attentive. "And now?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. "Now I think Being heard isn't as frightening as I thought. Her words settled gently. Between them, Elias nodded once, as if that made perfect sense. They stood there a while longer, the morning light growing stronger with each passing moment. The mountains seemed to wake slowly around them, alive in a quiet, steady way. After a few minutes, Clara spoke again. "There's something I want to say." Elias looked at her. She hesitated, but only briefly. Then, taking a small breath, she continued, properly this time. There was a difference in her tone now, not just in the clarity of her voice, but in the certainty behind it. Elias didn't interrupt. He simply waited. Clara turned to face him fully, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. For a moment, her eyes searched his, as if grounding herself. Then something steadied. Then she spoke. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice calm and sure. "And I'm not as afraid as I was when I came here." Elias's expression softened, just slightly. "I know," he said. Clara's lips curved into a small smile. "I didn't think I'd find this here," she admitted, glancing briefly at the cabin behind them, then back at him. "Not like this." "Neither did I," Elias replied. There was no hesitation in his voice, just truth. A quiet understanding passed between them, one that didn't need to be explained. Clara looked down for a moment, then back up again. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, but this time, they carried more than gratitude. They carried everything that had led to this moment. Elias held her gaze, considering his response. For a man who had spent so long choosing silence, words still didn't come easily. But he didn't turn away. "You stayed," he said. Instead, Clara blinked. "Surprised?" "Of course I did," she replied softly. "You could have left," he said. Clara shook her head gently. "I didn't want to." That answer lingered in the air, steady and certain. Elias looked back out at the mountains, the faintest hint of something new settling into his expression. For years, he had believed that solitude was enough, that the mountain could give him everything he needed. But standing there now, with Clara beside him, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. It wasn't about needing less, it was about allowing more. The light of the rising sun spread across the land, touching everything in its path: the trees, the melting snow, the quiet cabin perched on the ridge. A new beginning, not forced, not sudden, but earned. Clara stepped a little closer, her presence no longer uncertain, no longer temporary. Elias didn't move away. They stood side by side, facing the horizon, not as strangers, not as two people brought together by chance, but as something stronger, something chosen. The silence returned once more, but this time, it carried warmth, it carried trust, it carried the quiet promise of everything still to come. And as the sun rose fully above the mountains, neither of them looked away, because for the first time, they weren't just watching a new day begin. They were part of it.